From its inception in 1945, the United Nations was conceived publicly as a mechanism to prevent another global war. But beneath this stated purpose, it rapidly emerged as a uniquely valuable informational environment in which Cold War competition could be pursued without the visibility or escalation risks associated with traditional espionage. Because the organization aggregated political, economic, military, and social reporting from nearly every region of the world into a centralized institutional framework whose outputs carried the authority of international legitimacy rather than national interest. During the late 1940s, intelligence planners in both Washington and Moscow recognized that this characteristic made the UN fundamentally different from embassies or bilateral diplomatic channels, as information produced or circulated within the organization was often perceived as neutral, technical, or humanitarian in nature, even when it bore directly on issues of strategic importance. And this perception granted UN documentation disproportionate influence in shaping debates among states that lacked independent intelligence capabilities. The early Cold War environment magnified this significance as newly independent countries, war-damaged European states, and smaller powers increasingly relied on UN briefings, reports, and committee deliberations to form positions on security, development, and alignment, meaning that influence over UN information channels could indirectly shape the behavior of entire voting blocs without direct coercion. Intelligence services therefore approached the organization not as a target for traditional penetration, but as a system whose internal processes, staffing decisions, and reporting norms could be shaped over time to favor one bloc's strategic interpretation of global events. In the immediate post-war years, this struggle unfolded cautiously, as the UN's institutional norms were still forming and overt intelligence activity risked discrediting an organization whose legitimacy both superpowers publicly endorsed. Yet this very fluidity created opportunities because rules governing document classification, internal circulation, and staff vetting were still being debated, allowing early interventions to have enduring effects. Western intelligence assessments during this period emphasized the importance of protecting sensitive diplomatic and military information from inadvertent exposure through UN forums, particularly in Security Council debates and technical committees where national delegations were expected to share data in the interest of collective security, while Soviet intelligence doctrine treated the organization as an inherently hostile environment, dominated by capitalist states, and therefore requiring constant counterintelligence vigilance to prevent manipulation and isolation. This asymmetry in perception shaped early tactics, with Western services focusing on defensive measures and selective influence, and Soviet services prioritizing surveillance, monitoring, and the placement of loyal personnel who could observe and report on internal dynamics. As the UN Secretariat expanded and specialized agencies began producing detailed assessments of economic recovery, labor conditions, public health, and infrastructure, intelligence services on both sides identified these outputs as secondary intelligence sources that could corroborate or challenge classified reporting, particularly in regions where access was limited, and this recognition further elevated the importance of understanding how such reports were generated, edited, and disseminated. The struggle thus moved quickly beyond the question of access to the deeper issue of control over interpretation, as intelligence planners concluded that shaping how information was framed inside the UN could be as consequential as acquiring secrets, especially when UN findings were cited by diplomats, journalists, and policymakers as authoritative judgments rather than partisan claims. By the end of the 1940s, this realization had transformed the UN into a persistent arena of low-visibility intelligence competition, one in which Advantage was accumulated incrementally through bureaucratic familiarity, procedural leverage, and the cultivation of influence rather than through dramatic coups or exposures, setting the foundation for a struggle that would persist throughout the Cold War as the organization's reach and importance continued to grow. As the Cold War intensified in the early 1950s, intelligence competition inside the United Nations shifted from tentative exploration to systematic engagement, because by this stage both superpower blocs had acquired enough institutional knowledge to understand where informational leverage actually resided and how it could be exercised without provoking public scandal or institutional backlash. And this understanding produced a more disciplined approach that treated the UN not as a passive source of information, but as an active environment whose internal dynamics could be influenced through sustained presence and procedural mastery. Intelligence assessments from this period emphasized that the most consequential information rarely appeared in finalized resolutions or published reports, but rather in the drafting process itself, where preliminary data, competing interpretations, and internal disagreements were debated before being resolved into official language, and control over these pre-decisional stages offered the ability to anticipate outcomes and subtly shape them by influencing emphasis, scope, and framing. As a result, intelligence services paid increasing attention to departments responsible for political affairs, trusteeship, and economic analysis, recognizing that officials in these units acted as gatekeepers who filtered field-level reporting and determined what information reached senior leadership and member states. The Soviet Union responded by expanding its monitoring of Secretariat personnel, compiling detailed assessments of backgrounds, professional networks, and ideological tendencies, and by encouraging allied states to nominate candidates for key positions who could counterbalance perceived Western dominance, while Western services focused on reinforcing internal security practices and promoting administrative norms that emphasized methodological rigor and transparency, calculating that standardized procedures would reduce opportunities for covert distortion. This reciprocal adaptation produced an environment in which overt espionage was neither necessary nor desirable, because influence could be exercised through routine bureaucratic interactions that left no clear evidence of intelligence direction, such as shaping committee agendas, encouraging particular analytical frameworks, or delaying the circulation of reports until political conditions were favorable. Intelligence reporting from the early 1950s also highlighted the growing importance of informal networks within the UN, as personal relationships among officials, diplomats, and experts often determined how information was shared and interpreted outside formal channels, and both blocs devoted resources to mapping these networks, identifying individuals whose access and credibility made them influential nodes in the organizational ecosystem. The strategic value of these networks was amplified by the UN's expanding role in decolonization, as newly independent states relied heavily on Secretariat briefings and technical assistance assessments to navigate international politics, creating an audience for UN information whose trust could be shaped through careful framing and consistent messaging. Intelligence services recognized that influencing how these states perceived conflicts, development challenges, and security risks could indirectly affect alignment choices, making the UN a conduit for long-term strategic competition, rather than a venue for immediate tactical gain. Within this context, the struggle over intelligence channels extended into specialized agencies dealing with labor, health, education, and agriculture, whose ostensibly technical reports contained data that could reveal economic vulnerabilities, social unrest, and governance capacity, and intelligence assessments treated these outputs as indicators that could corroborate or challenge classified reporting from other sources. Both blocs, therefore, sought to ensure that collection methodologies, data validation processes, and interpretive frameworks within these agencies did not systematically favor the other side's narrative, leading to quiet contests over staffing, funding priorities, and analytical standards that unfolded far from public view. The UN leadership attempted to manage these pressures by strengthening professional norms and insulating staff from overt political influence. Yet intelligence services adapted by working within these norms rather than against them, recognizing that credibility was itself a form of power in an institution whose authority rested on perceived neutrality. By the mid-1950s, the contest over UN intelligence channels had become an exercise in endurance rather than penetration, with advantage accruing to those who could maintain consistent engagement over time, anticipate shifts in institutional priorities, and respond quickly to emerging issues before narratives solidified, ensuring that intelligence competition remained embedded in the daily functioning of the organization rather than erupting into crises that could undermine its legitimacy. This phase of the struggle demonstrated that control of information in a multilateral setting depended less on secrecy than on influence over process, a lesson that would shape intelligence engagement with the UN for decades as the Cold War expanded in scope and complexity. As the United Nations expanded its operational footprint during the mid-1950s and into the early 1960s, the intelligence struggle over its information channels acquired greater strategic depth because the organization was no longer confined to conference rooms and diplomatic exchanges, but increasingly present on the ground through observation missions, technical surveys, and development programs that generated first-hand reporting from politically sensitive regions. And this transformation elevated the UN from a forum of interpretation to a producer of primary information whose outputs could shape international responses before national intelligence services had fully assessed unfolding situations. Intelligence assessments from this period emphasized that reports produced by UN field personnel often carried an aura of impartiality that made them influential in shaping debates among member states, particularly when those reports addressed ceasefire compliance, electoral processes, economic viability, or humanitarian conditions in contested areas. And this influence made the framing of such reports a matter of strategic concern for both superpower blocs. The Soviet Union approached this development with persistent suspicion, viewing UN field activity as a potential vector for Western intelligence collection under the cover of neutrality, and Soviet intelligence services therefore devoted substantial effort to monitoring mission composition, mandate language, and reporting chains to ensure that information flows did not disproportionately advantage adversaries, while Western intelligence services, though generally supportive of expanded UN activity, remained alert to the possibility that Soviet-aligned personnel could shape findings in ways that minimized scrutiny of Allied actions or diluted Western diplomatic objectives. This reciprocal vigilance produced a continuous contest over staffing decisions, leadership appointments, and the interpretation of mission mandates, with both sides recognizing that control over who observed, who reported, and who synthesized findings could be as consequential as control over territory. Intelligence reporting from the late 1950s also highlighted the importance of procedural timing, noting that the release of UN reports at critical junctures could influence Security Council deliberations, General Assembly debates, or public opinion, and intelligence services therefore sought to anticipate publication schedules and to influence internal deliberations that determined when information would be circulated, an effort that required deep familiarity with bureaucratic routines rather than clandestine access. As peacekeeping operations multiplied, the informational value of UN reporting increased, providing insights into local power structures, military dispositions, and negotiation dynamics that were otherwise difficult to obtain without overt intervention. And intelligence services integrated these outputs into broader analytical frameworks, treating them as complementary sources that could validate or challenge classified assessments. This integration reinforced the strategic importance of ensuring that UN information channels were neither monopolized by adversaries nor compromised in ways that undermined credibility, leading both blocs to adopt a posture of constrained engagement that balanced influence with restraint. During this period, intelligence competition inside the UN was further complicated by the rise of non-aligned states, whose representatives increasingly shaped outcomes in multilateral forums and whose perceptions were often informed by UN documentation rather than bilateral briefings, making the organization a key arena in which legitimacy was constructed and contested. Intelligence services recognized that influencing how these states interpreted UN reports could affect voting patterns and diplomatic alignments over time, even in the absence of overt pressure. And this recognition reinforced the emphasis on long-term engagement rather than episodic intervention. By the early 1960s, the struggle over UN intelligence channels had become embedded in routine operations, shaping how information was collected, framed, and disseminated across a widening range of issues, and reinforcing the reality that in a Cold War defined by global reach and institutional complexity, intelligence competition extended beyond secret files into the visible yet subtle processes through which international knowledge was produced and authorized. As the Cold War moved into the late 1960s and early 1970s, the intelligence struggle over United Nations information channels was increasingly shaped by the paradox of institutional openness, because the UN's legitimacy depended on transparency, inclusivity, and standardized procedures. Yet those same qualities created predictable pathways through which information could be anticipated, interpreted, and influenced by actors who understood the system's internal logic, and intelligence services adjusted their strategies accordingly, shifting attention toward the management of expectations and the long-term shaping of analytical norms rather than the pursuit of discrete informational gains. Intelligence assessments from this period emphasize that while most UN documentation was formally accessible to member states, the practical value of information depended on how it was contextualized, summarized, and prioritized within internal briefings, committee discussions, and official reports, and control over these interpretive layers offered a means of influence that was subtle yet enduring. Both superpower blocs, therefore, invested heavily in understanding the professional cultures of key UN departments, recognizing that assumptions embedded in analytical practice, such as how causality was assessed or how uncertainty was expressed, could tilt interpretations in ways that favored one narrative over another without violating formal neutrality. The era of détente added complexity to this environment as improved superpower relations reduced overt confrontation while heightening sensitivity to perception management, particularly among non-aligned states whose diplomatic positions were shaped by multilateral discourse rather than alliance commitments, and intelligence services assessed that influence within the UN during this period would be exercised primarily through the shaping of consensus rather than through direct opposition. The Soviet Union approached this challenge by maintaining rigorous counterintelligence oversight, concerned that expanded cooperation and information sharing could provide Western services with indirect access to sensitive perspectives. And Soviet intelligence reporting highlighted the risk that seemingly technical discussions could embed political assumptions that disadvantage socialist positions, prompting continued scrutiny of drafting processes and committee deliberations. Western intelligence services, while operating within a more open administrative culture, were equally attentive to the risk that Soviet-aligned personnel could frame issues in ways that normalized coercive behavior or obscured violations of international norms, and they therefore focused on reinforcing analytical rigor and evidentiary standards as a means of constraining narrative manipulation. This mutual emphasis on process rather than penetration produced an intelligence environment characterized by constant low-level engagement, in which influence was exercised through participation, expertise, and persistence rather than clandestine intervention. Intelligence reporting from UN peacekeeping and observer missions during this period illustrates how even routine observations could carry strategic weight, as assessments of ceasefire stability, force posture, or civilian conditions were frequently cited in diplomatic debates, and intelligence services monitored these reporting streams closely to anticipate how they might shape decisions on mandate, renewal, troop deployment, or negotiation strategy. The increasing complexity of UN operations required intelligence agencies to integrate UN-derived information into broader analytical frameworks, recognizing that multilateral reporting could corroborate or challenge national intelligence in ways that affected policy choices. And this integration reinforced the importance of understanding how UN data were generated and validated. At the same time, intelligence services were aware that excessive manipulation risked undermining the UN's credibility, an outcome that would diminish its utility as an informational platform and push competition back into more confrontational bilateral channels. And this awareness imposed a degree of restraint that shaped the character of the struggle. The rise of global media coverage during this period further amplified the significance of UN information channels, as reports and resolutions were increasingly disseminated to domestic publics, transforming internal assessments into public narratives that could influence opinion and constrain policymaking, and intelligence services incorporated this dimension into their planning, treating the UN not only as a source of elite-level information, but as a generator of narratives with mass impact. By the early 1970s, the struggle over UN intelligence channels had become deeply institutionalized, embedded in routines that governed how information was produced, debated, and released, and characterized by an acceptance that influence would be incremental and contested rather than decisive. This phase of the Cold War demonstrated that in an era defined by multilateralism and global communication, intelligence competition operated less through secrecy than through sustained engagement with institutional process, reinforcing the reality that control over international information flows was a function of endurance, credibility, and procedural mastery, rather than dramatic espionage, successes. As the Cold War progressed through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, the intelligence struggle over United Nations information channels reflected a convergence of maturity and constraint, because by this stage, the organization's bureaucratic structures were deeply entrenched, its professional norms widely internalized, and its role in global governance broadly accepted. Yet the geopolitical environment remained volatile enough that control over interpretation and legitimacy continued to matter, and intelligence services adapted by refining methods that operated within these constraints rather than attempting to circumvent them. Intelligence assessments from this period emphasized that the UN had become a critical interface between regional conflicts and global diplomacy, particularly as proxy wars, civil conflicts, and post-colonial instability generated demands for mediation, monitoring, and humanitarian engagement, and the information produced through these activities shaped how responsibility, compliance, and credibility were assigned in international discourse. Both superpower blocs understood that while they could rarely dictate outcomes within the UN, they could influence the boundaries of acceptable interpretation, by shaping how evidence was contextualized, how uncertainty was framed, and which dimensions of a conflict were emphasized or marginalized. And this understanding reinforced a focus on procedural engagement rather than overt manipulation. The Soviet Union continued to view the organization through a counterintelligence lens, concerned that Western dominance in administrative culture, technical expertise, and media access could translate into informational advantage, and Soviet intelligence services therefore maintained systematic monitoring of internal UN processes, staffing patterns, and analytical trends to identify shifts that might disadvantage Allied positions, while Western intelligence services focused on ensuring that UN reporting did not normalize coercive behavior or obscure violations that could undermine the credibility of international norms. This reciprocal vigilance produced a stable yet contested environment in which intelligence influence was exercised primarily through participation in committees, contribution to methodological debates, and engagement with professional standards that governed data collection and analysis. Intelligence reporting from UN peacekeeping operations during this period illustrates how even minor variations in language could have strategic implications, as assessments of ceasefire compliance, force posture, or civilian protection were frequently cited in Security Council deliberations and media coverage, shaping diplomatic leverage and constraining policy options, and intelligence services monitored these reporting streams closely to anticipate how they might affect negotiation dynamics or mandate decisions. The growing prominence of humanitarian issues further expanded the scope of intelligence interest in UN channels, as reports on refugee flows, food security, and public health provided insights into state capacity and social stability that were relevant to strategic planning, and intelligence services assessed that influence over how such data were interpreted could affect decisions about aid, sanctions, and political engagement in ways that had long-term consequences. The era's emphasis on multilateral solutions also increased the importance of consensus building within the UN, and intelligence agencies evaluated how coalitions formed around particular interpretations of events, paying close attention to the informational cues that influenced non-aligned states whose votes were often decisive, reinforcing the perception that control over narrative framing could yield cumulative strategic benefits even when immediate outcomes were limited. At the same time, intelligence services recognized that excessive interference risked undermining the UN's legitimacy, an outcome that would reduce its utility as an informational platform and potentially shift competition into less predictable arenas. And this recognition imposed a degree of restraint that shaped the character of engagement, favoring subtlety and endurance over aggressive intervention. Technological change during this period also influenced the intelligence struggle, as advances in communication and data processing increased the speed and volume of information flowing through the UN, complicating efforts to monitor and influence reporting, but also creating new opportunities for early engagement in framing and synthesis. And intelligence services adapted by developing specialized expertise in UN procedures and documentation to manage this complexity. By the early 1980s, the struggle over UN intelligence channels had become an accepted, if largely invisible, dimension of Cold War competition, embedded in routine interactions and professional norms rather than dramatic confrontations, and characterized by a shared understanding among major powers that the organization's value lay precisely in its credibility, which could be influenced but not openly compromised. This phase demonstrated that intelligence competition within multilateral institutions was governed by a logic distinct from bilateral espionage, one in which advantage was incremental, contingent, and inseparable from the maintenance of institutional legitimacy. reinforcing the reality that in a world increasingly structured by international organizations, the battle for information was waged through sustained engagement with process rather than through decisive acts of penetration or exposure. As the Cold War approached its final decade, the intelligence struggle over United Nations information channels increasingly reflected the accumulated weight of 4 decades of institutional competition. Because by the 1980s, both superpower blocs had internalized the lessons of earlier periods and approached the UN with a shared understanding that influence would be exercised through endurance, credibility, and procedural fluency, rather than through any expectation of decisive control. And intelligence assessments from this era framed the organization less as a contested frontier and more as a managed environment whose informational outputs had to be continuously monitored, contextualized, and, where possible, shaped. The UN's expanded involvement in regional conflicts during this period, including mediation efforts, observer missions, and humanitarian coordination, generated detailed streams of reporting that fed directly into Security Council deliberations and international media narratives, making the framing of these reports strategically consequential even when enforcement options were limited, and intelligence services on both sides devoted sustained attention to how mission mandates were written, how reporting criteria were defined, and how findings were summarized for senior decision makers, recognizing that these upstream decisions constrained outcomes long before votes were taken or statements issued. Intelligence analysis from the early 1980s emphasized that the credibility of UN reporting had become one of its most valuable attributes, because in an era of information saturation and competing narratives, assessments produced under the UN's auspices carried a presumption of impartiality that national intelligence estimates did not, and this presumption made them influential among non-aligned states, international organizations, and domestic audiences, all of which increasingly consumed UN outputs through expanding global media coverage. Both superpower blocs therefore approach the organization with a dual imperative to influence interpretation without undermining credibility, a balance that required restraint and subtlety rather than overt interference, and intelligence services adapted by prioritizing engagement with professional norms, methodological debates, and analytical frameworks that shaped how evidence was weighed and uncertainty expressed. The Soviet Union, while undergoing internal strains and facing economic and political challenges, continued to view the UN through a counterintelligence lens, concerned that Western dominance in media access, technical expertise, and administrative culture could translate into disproportionate narrative influence, and Soviet intelligence reporting from this period focused on detecting trends in UN analysis that might normalize Western interpretations of conflict or marginalize socialist perspectives, while Western intelligence services, operating within a broader information environment shaped by rapid communication and public scrutiny, focused on ensuring that UN reporting did not obscure coercive behavior or create false equivalence in conflicts where responsibility was contested. This reciprocal scrutiny reinforced a pattern in which influence was exercised through participation in expert discussions, contribution to methodological refinement, and early engagement in mandate formulation rather than through clandestine penetration. And success was measured by the absence of unfavorable narratives as much as by the presence of favorable ones. Technological change further complicated this environment as advances in satellite communication, data processing, and information dissemination increased the speed with which UN reports circulated and reduced the window for reactive influence, compelling intelligence services to anticipate issues earlier in the process and to develop specialized expertise capable of operating within compressed timelines. Intelligence assessments from this period also noted that the UN had become a central forum for the articulation of international norms related to human rights, humanitarian intervention, and development, and that reports produced under its auspices increasingly shaped expectations about acceptable state behavior, making influence over these informational channels relevant not only to immediate strategic interests, but to the longer-term evolution of the international system. Within this context, the struggle over UN intelligence channels intersected with broader debates about legitimacy and authority in global governance, as both blocs sought to ensure that emerging norms did not constrain their freedom of action, while still preserving the organization's role as a stabilizing mechanism, and intelligence services treated engagement with these debates as an extension of strategic competition rather than a departure from it. By the mid-1980s, the intelligence struggle inside the UN had thus become deeply institutionalized, embedded in routines that governed how information was produced, validated, and disseminated, and characterized by a shared understanding that influence would be cumulative and contested rather than decisive, reflecting the broader reality of a Cold War increasingly defined by management rather than escalation. This phase underscored that control over information in a multilateral setting was inseparable from the maintenance of institutional legitimacy, and that intelligence services, having adapted to this constraint, operated less as clandestine disruptors and more as persistent participants in an informational ecosystem whose rules they could shape but not openly break. In the final accounting of the Cold War struggle over United Nations intelligence channels, what emerged was not a story of decisive victories or dramatic penetrations, but of sustained competition conducted within the constraints of an institution whose legitimacy both superpower blocs had a vested interest in preserving. Because by the end of the 1980s, the UN had become an indispensable component of global governance and an equally indispensable arena for managing perception, interpretation, and legitimacy in a world still shaped by rivalry. Intelligence assessments from the late Cold War period emphasized that the organization's value lay precisely in its credibility, as information produced through UN mechanisms was widely regarded as impartial, even when it intersected with contested political issues, and this credibility transformed routine reports, mission briefings, and analytical summaries into instruments that could influence diplomatic outcomes, public opinion, and alliance behavior without the need for overt coercion. The long struggle to influence these channels therefore reflected a strategic calculation shared by both sides, that shaping how information was framed and understood within the UN could yield cumulative advantages over time, even when immediate policy outcomes remained beyond direct control. Throughout the Cold War, intelligence services adapted their tradecraft to this reality, moving away from expectations of secrecy and exclusivity toward a model of engagement that prioritized procedural fluency, early involvement in mandate formulation, and sustained participation in analytical debates, recognizing that in a multilateral environment, influence accrued to those who understood and navigated institutional processes most effectively. This adaptation blurred the distinction between intelligence activity and diplomacy, as intelligence agencies worked in close coordination with national delegations to anticipate how UN outputs would be received by diverse audiences, particularly non-aligned states whose positions were shaped more by multilateral discourse than by bilateral pressure, reinforcing the importance of narrative framing as a strategic objective. The Soviet Union's eventual internal transformation and the easing of East-West confrontation did not retroactively diminish the significance of this struggle, because the practices developed over decades had shaped how international information was produced and contested, leaving a legacy in which multilateral institutions were understood as arenas of quiet competition, even when ideological rivalry receded. In this sense, the Cold War struggle over UN intelligence channels demonstrated that intelligence power in an institutionalized international order was inherently constrained, operating not through domination, but through continuous interaction with bureaucratic norms, professional standards, and legitimacy claims that could be influenced but not openly subverted. The endurance of this model underscored a broader lesson of the Cold War, that as global politics became increasingly mediated by international organizations, the battle for advantage shifted from the acquisition of secrets to the management of meaning, and intelligence services that adapted to this shift were able to exert influence without undermining the very platforms that made such influence possible. By the time the Cold War ended, the UN had been shaped by decades of informational contestation that left it neither neutral nor captured, but continuously negotiated, and the intelligence struggle within it stood as an example of how rivalry could be embedded in routine processes rather than resolved through decisive confrontation, illustrating that in a world governed by collective mechanisms, the most consequential intelligence battles were often fought not in the shadows, but in the subtle terrain of interpretation, procedure, and legitimacy that defined international order.